The morning of her wedding, Cecily Hartwell stood at the window of her father's smaller sitting room and watched a magpie pull something bright from the frozen grass. The housemaid was pinning the back of her dress, and the pins were cold, and the dress was plain white muslin that had been turned out again from her mother's old trunk. Outside, the road that ran north toward Drenmore was gray with November light. She could not see very far along it. Behind her, through the open door to the passage, she heard Mrs. Arabella Quint's voice, carrying with its usual perfect indifference to walls. Poor creature. The beast's bride. A pause, and then quieter, and then a murmur that Cecily could not make out, but did not need to, because the shape of the thing was clear enough without the particular syllables. The magpie flew away. Cecily breathed in and breathed out, steadily. The way her mother had once taught her was the only reliable discipline left to a woman in an arranged circumstance. She looked at the road. She had known for 3 weeks that she was to be married. Her father, Baron Hartwell, had told her on a Wednesday evening after supper, in the tone he used when he had decided something was finished and required only her acknowledgement to become so. The Marquis of Drenmore had called on him privately and made an offer. The settlement was agreeable. The debt, the £7,000 that had followed the family like a dog since her father's speculative investments in 1812, would be satisfied in full. It would not be discussed further. She would be comfortable. Drenmore was a good house. She had asked one question only. She had asked whether the Marquis had wished to meet her first. Her father had looked at her with that mild, tired patience he reserved for questions that were beside the point. He had not answered directly. He had said that the Marquis was not a man who made decisions frivolously, and that it was a good settlement, and that she ought to write to the mantua-maker by Thursday. The magpie was gone. The housemaid pressed the last pin home and stepped back. The dress fit well enough. Cecily turned away from the window. She had heard things about the Marquis of Drenmore before this. Everyone in the county had. He was a man of 34, she knew, inherited at 26, widowed at 33. The first Marchioness had died in childbed last winter, and the circumstances were such that, well, no one said it plainly, only in the way that county society did its most vicious work, which was to say nothing directly and allow the nothing to harden into something solid that could not thereafter be disputed. The Marquis did not come to the assemblies. He did not call at houses. When he was seen at church, he sat at the far end of the family pew, with his face turned toward the wall, and people who looked at that face long enough came away with the impression of a scar that ran from cheek to jaw, and a set of gray eyes that did not invite the return of their attention. They called him the Beast of Drenmore, sometimes simply the Beast, and the name had the comfortable permanence of names that have been in circulation long enough that no one precisely remembers the first occasion of their use. Cecily Hartwell had once been described by her mother's sister as a girl no one notices until they need her. She did not consider this a cruelty. It was accurate. She had spent 22 years acquiring the skill of attending to rooms without being attended to, of reading the weather of a house before she crossed the threshold, of making herself small in the spaces where a woman who made herself large would suffer for it. She had 2 useful accomplishments. She could play the pianoforte tolerably well, and she could keep an account book without error, and she had no useful connections, no living mother, no substantial portion beyond the settlement her father had now absorbed into a debt payment. She had expected the season's usual verdict, which was to be placed slightly lower than she deserved, and to accept it. She had not expected to be handed to a man the county called a beast on a Wednesday evening after supper, with a suggestion to write to the mantua-maker. The ceremony was brief and cold, and attended only by the necessary parties. The vicar was kind. hurrying through the service with the efficiency of a man who understood that speed was its own form of mercy. Cecily stood at the front of the small church and repeated the words she was asked to repeat, and at no point during this process did the man beside her look at her directly. She saw his hands when the vicar indicated the ring. They were steady. She noticed this because she was counting the things she could observe in the absence of words, and steady hands were more information than she had expected. Afterward, in the carriage north toward Drenmore, they sat at proper distance on opposite seats and said almost nothing for 50 minutes. He asked once whether she was cold. She said she was not, which was not precisely true but was true enough. He accepted this without comment and looked out the window at the gray November fields. His face in three-quarter view showed the length of the scar more clearly than it had at the church. The line running from below the left cheekbone to the jaw, with the particular neatness of an old healed thing that had been a ragged thing once. His eyes, when he occasionally shifted to look ahead at the road, were the color of a winter sky. Not cold, she thought, but still, like ice over a river that was still moving underneath. Drenmore itself announced itself first as a roofline against the hill, gray stone against a gray sky, and then as a long, formal face of Georgian proportion with 2 rows of tall windows and an entrance park that had been designed for carriages of greater consequence. The elm trees that lined the approach had been planted with the house and had outgrown it in ambition. They stood in their November bareness with a patience Cecily found, under the circumstances, companionable. The carriage slowed through the final turn and drew up before a door that was opened by a footman before they had fully stopped. The housekeeper, Mrs. Garland, was waiting at the step with 2 footmen and a parlor-maid arranged behind her. She was a woman of perhaps 60, gray-haired under her housekeeper's cap, with a face that had clearly been warm once and had learned a more careful arrangement since. When she looked at Cecily as she descended from the carriage, Cecily saw something in that careful face that was not quite relief and not quite apology, and was, she thought, some compound of both. Lady Prudence Vane was waiting in the hall. Cecily had not been told she would be there. She came forward with the measured bearing of a woman who knew that entering a room was a form of claiming it. She was tall, in black silk, silver-haired under her period cap, with pale blue eyes that moved over Cecily from hem to hair in the time it took to offer a hand. "My nephew's bride," she said. The words were perfectly correct. The warmth was entirely absent. At the wedding breakfast that followed, a modest affair with the table set for 12 and not full, Lady Prudence Vane said, in a voice pitched for the 3 ladies nearest her, "One does what one must, I suppose. The beast's bride needs must be some creature or other." She lifted her cup of tea and drank. The ladies nearest her said nothing, which was its own kind of ratification. Nathaniel Vane, at the head of the table, did not look up from his plate. Cecily looked at him across the table and revised the question she had been turning over since the carriage. She had been asking whether he was monstrous. She began instead to ask why he did not look up. The first week at Drenmore was a study in the anatomy of a house that had forgotten how to breathe. The rooms were clean and maintained with Mrs. Garland's careful efficiency, but the furniture was arranged as it had always been arranged, and the pianoforte in the drawing-room had not been played in some time, and the flowers that had been placed in the entrance hall upon Cecily's arrival were not replaced when they began to turn. She did not say this. She observed it as she observed the arrangement of the small portraits on the second-floor landing, the particular one at the top of the stairs that had been turned to face the wall. The portrait, she learned from a tentative inquiry to Mrs. Garland, was of the late Marchioness. It had been turned by the Marquis himself the morning after the funeral. Mrs. Garland did not elaborate, and Cecily did not press. She met Edmund on the second morning. He was brought to her by his nurse, a young Welsh woman named Bethan, who carried him with the practiced ease of someone who loved what she carried. He was just shy of 2 years old, fair-haired, with his father's gray eyes blinking in a face that was round and uncertain and alive. He looked at Cecily without the caution she had expected from a child raised in a silent house. He looked at her with the frank open attention of a person who had not yet been taught that the world requires wariness. She held out her finger. He grasped it. In his other hand he held a small painted card, not much larger than a calling card, a miniature no formal artist had made, the brushwork quick and personal, clearly the hand of someone who loved the subject rather than a trained portraitist. On the card was a moth. It was painted with the kind of attention that notices things other people walk past, the precise dusting of the wing, the slight furring of the body, the one leg raised. Not a butterfly, a moth. "What is that?" she asked Bethan. "His mother made it," Bethan said carefully. "He will not sleep without it." Cecily looked at the child holding his mother's painting and felt something settle in her chest, quiet and serious. She did not name it immediately. She filed it beside steady hands and a face turned away from a scar, and let it wait. Lady Prudence Vane held court in the blue drawing-room each morning, and it was in these morning hours that Cecily had occasion to observe the shape of the aunt's authority in the house. She managed Bethan's schedule for Edmund's care. She directed Mrs. Garland on the question of menus. She received correspondence at the estate's address without, Cecily noted, appearing to consult Nathaniel about any of it. She moved through Drenmore with the confidence of a woman who has decided the house is hers, by a logic she does not intend to explain. Cecily said little in these morning sessions. She listened. She was good at listening. One morning, the 7th day, Lady Prudence said without particular preface, "You will find the county expects very little of you, I think. The Drenmore name requires only that it not be further embarrassed. What it has already endured." She paused, with a precision that made the pause its own sentence. "Sufficiently well known." "I should be glad to know what it has endured," Cecily said, which was the closest she had come to directness with the woman since the wedding breakfast. Lady Prudence looked at her. The pale blue eyes adjusted. Something in them became more careful. "My nephew is not a man given to restraint in moments of strong feeling," she said. "His wife before you would have told you this, had she lived to do so." She left the room before Cecily could reply. Cecily sat with the teacup she had not finished, and thought about the late Marchioness, and about a child who would not sleep without a painting of a moth that his father had turned to face the wall. These two things did not belong to the same story. She was not certain she had been given the correct story. She found him in the nursery at 11 minutes past 3 in the morning. She had woken with the kind of wakefulness that arrives fully formed, no gradual coming to, and had lain in the dark of her chamber, listening to Drenmore settle around her. After 20 minutes, she had put on her wrapper and taken the small candle from the nightstand and walked the corridor without particular direction, which was how she came to the nursery door, standing slightly open and a low sound coming from inside. She pushed the door wider. He was in the chair beside Edmund's crib, large in the small space, the navy coat shed over the back of the chair, and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. Edmund lay in the crib with the moth painting loose in one small open hand. Nathaniel was reading from a book held low near the candle, and the sound she had heard was his voice at a register so subdued it was nearly something else, a murmur, a rhythm, not quite speech, and not quite song. Edmund's eyes were shut. He had been asleep for some time, by the quality of his breathing. His father was still reading. He heard her at the door and stopped. He looked up. In the candlelight, the scar along his jaw was a quiet fact, nothing dramatic, and his gray eyes above it had that same winter sky stillness. But something in them, in the minute adjustment of his expression, was the look of a man who had been caught at a tenderness he had decided to keep private. She did not retreat. She stepped into the room and let the door ease back to its partial position behind her. He said after a moment, "You should not be cold in the passage." The voice was low, instinctively so, pitched not to wake Edmund. The words were a command. Cecily heard, underneath them, a man who was concerned about the temperature of the corridor at 3 a.m, and she understood, in the same moment, that this concern was the nearest he had come to saying something else entirely. "I am not cold," she said, quietly. A pause. He looked at the book, then back at her. "He wakes sometimes," he said. "It is easier if he hears a voice." She looked at Edmund, at the small, loose hand and the moth painting. She said, "She was a good painter." He did not answer for a moment. When he did, his voice was level, but only by effort she could hear. "She painted very quickly. She said it was the only way to catch things before they changed." Cecily looked at him. He was looking at his son. She said, "I will leave you to it." And she moved to go. And he said, without inflection, "There is a second chair." And so she sat in the second chair beside the crib, and he returned to his reading in that near, song-like register. And Edmund slept with his mother's moth loose in his hand, and the candle burned lower. They did not speak again until the candle was nearly spent, when Nathaniel closed the book and said quietly, "I did not choose you carelessly." She did not know what to do with this. She turned it over, the way one turns a coin to see whether both sides bear the same image. She said, "I did not suppose you did anything carelessly." Something at the corner of his mouth shifted. She thought it might be the beginning of a different kind of expression. It was gone before it arrived. He said, "You may come here at night, if you wake. He likes company." A pause. "They both do, I think." This was as much as he had said at once in her hearing. She recognized it as a door being opened, slightly, by a man who had forgotten how doors worked. She walked back to her own chamber and lay awake for an hour, turning the thing over. The revelation came 3 weeks in the library on a Tuesday afternoon, when the rain had made the park impassable, and Lady Prudence Vane was at Mrs. Quint's house on a visit Cecily suspected was something other than purely social. She had gone to the library to find a book, and found instead Nathaniel at the large desk with a letter spread open before him, and a stillness about him that told her, before she could retreat, that whatever the letter was, it was not good news. She started to back out. He looked up. "Stay," he said. Not a demand. Something different from a demand. She stayed. She sat in the chair by the window with her book and did not read it, and presently he folded the letter and set it down and said, without preamble, "My aunt is seeking the guardianship of my son." Cecily set the book in her lap. She looked at him. He told her then, in short, declarative sentences with the spaces between them, that a man uses when he is choosing what to say carefully, because he has not said it aloud before. Helena had died in childbed. He had been at Drenmore, not away, which contradicted certain accounts that had circulated. He had been in the house and had been told too late to come to her, and the things he had thought and done in the hours after were not things he was able to speak of at any length even now. But the shape of them was that he had remained in the house, that he had not attended the public funeral in its full form, that he had been absent from the world in a way that absence takes on when a man cannot decide how to re-enter it. In that absence, Lady Prudence had begun to speak to people. She had spoken carefully. In the manner of someone making a case without appearing to make a case, she had cited his scar, his silence, his failure to attend his own wife's burial service at the church, his refusal of calls, his retreat from society. She had shaped these into the outline of something that could, if arranged at the correct angle, look like the outline of a man whose first wife had not died but been driven to her grave. She had never said this directly. She had merely left the outline where it could be seen. Her son, Gerald Forsyth, stood to inherit Drenmore if Edmund could be removed from Nathaniel's care and placed with Lady Prudence. If Edmund were raised at the Forsyth house, if Gerald were named guardian-in-law, the estate's management would follow in practice, even if not in letter. "Why did you not fight it?" Cecily said. He was quiet for a moment. Fighting it would have required speaking publicly about Helena's death. Who was there? What was said? The particular cruelties of that night. His voice did not change its register. I was not willing to do that. She looked at him across the library, at the still face with the scar along the jaw and the gray eyes with their winter sky quality, at the man who had sat in the nursery reading to a sleeping child in the dark. And she thought that Lady Prudence Vane had been counting on exactly this. She has been counting on his being unwilling to speak, because he is the kind of man who protects what was private about the dead by enduring what the living say about him in place of it. This was not monstrousness. This was grief wearing the costume grief borrows from stone when it has nowhere else to go. If you have stayed with this story so far, you understand why it could not have ended anywhere but where it is going. Stay with it a little longer. She said, "Mrs. Garland was there. Was she not, the night Helena died?" He looked at her with the quality of attention he gave to things that surprised him, which was a quality of full and unsettled stillness. "Yes." "And the physician? Is he still in the county?" "Dr. Harwick. Yes, he is in Ashcroft." "And is there a letter?" she said. "From Helena. Any letter she wrote in the last months?" A pause, longer than the others. He opened the drawer of the desk and placed on the surface a folded letter, sealed and unbroken. "She left it for Edmund," he said, "for when he was old enough." Cecily looked at the letter. She did not touch it. She said, "If Lady Prudence's petition goes before the magistrate, you will need Mrs. Garland and Dr. Harwick. You will need the record of who was where that night. You will need to give me permission to speak to both of them." He regarded her for a long moment. The expression on his face was not the expression of a man being offered help. It was the expression of a man encountering, for the first time in some years, a thing that was not loss. "You do not have to," he said. "No," she said. "I do not." She held his gaze without flinching, and he held hers, and the rain came at the library window with its patient November force, and neither of them moved. She was aware of exactly where he was in the room, of the warmth that crossed the distance between the chair by the window and the desk, of the way his breathing had altered in some small and involuntary way. She did not look away. He said her name. Just her given name, no title, no surname. Cecily. As if he were testing whether it fit in his mouth. As if it were a door being opened wider. She said, "I will speak to Mrs. Garland tomorrow." She rose and crossed the room and set the book back on its shelf. And she was at the door when he said, quietly, "I did not think you would stay." She paused with her hand at the doorframe. "I do not leave things I have begun," she said. She walked back to her chamber with her pulse visible in her throat, with the particular awareness of having committed to something irrevocable. which was not at all different from the feeling, she thought, of stepping toward rather than away. Mrs. Garland did not hesitate when Cecily sat with her in the housekeeper's small room the following morning. She had been waiting, she said simply, for someone to ask. She told Cecily about the night in December, naming where each person was, at what hour, who sent for the physician, what time the Marquis had been informed, and the fact, which she stated without elaboration, but without room for dispute, that no voice had ever been raised in anger in this house in the whole of the Marquis's marriage, and that whatever else Lady Prudence Vane had been saying to the county, she had not been in this house on the night in question, and had no particular authority on the subject of what had or had not occurred within it. She also said quietly that Lady Prudence Vane had been in the house 3 times in the past fortnight, each time for longer than her stated purpose required, and that she had twice been found in the passage near the nursery. Cecily wrote to Dr. Harwick the same afternoon. His reply came within 3 days, a brief letter, clear and unambiguous, stating the facts of the Marchioness's death as he had recorded them in his own notes, and his willingness to appear before any magistrate or county authority on the matter, if so called. She told Nathaniel that evening. He read the physician's letter twice, carefully, and then he looked at her, with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man who has been carrying something for so long that the moment of being offered help arrives before he has thought to ask for it. He said, "You did this quietly." "I did it usefully," she said. He set the letter down. He said, "Cecily." And then he said nothing else for a long moment, but he reached across the desk and placed his hand over hers, not gripping, only covering, the warmth of it exact and deliberate. His face was completely still and completely open, which she was learning was what he looked like when he chose to show her something that he otherwise kept. She turned her hand over and let her fingers rest against his. His thumb moved once, across her knuckles, a touch so light it might have been incidental if anything else about it had been incidental. She wanted, with a force that had no polite name, to stay there indefinitely. She did not move. "Whatever she does," she said, "we will answer it together." Lady Prudence Vane's petition was filed before the county magistrate, Sir Aldous Crane, on the 15th of December. It bore Gerald Forsyth's signature and 2 others from the county's second tier of gentry, and it cited the Marquis's irregular conduct since his first wife's death and his ungovernable temper, and requested that the care of the minor Edmund Vane be transferred to the guardianship of Lady Prudence Vane for the child's welfare. A supplementary document, signed by the Forsyth family solicitor, attempted to characterize the present marriage settlement as entered under conditions that invited legal review. The petition became known in the county within 48 hours of its filing, because nothing in county society remains a private matter for longer than it takes Mrs. Quint to call upon 3 houses on consecutive afternoons. Cecily heard it from Mrs. Garland, who brought it to her with the directness of a woman who believes the truth told plainly is a lesser injury than the truth discovered sideways. She sat with it for the remainder of that evening in the small sitting room off her chamber, which had a fire and a window, and very little else to recommend it. And she thought about what it meant to have the thing she had feared most arrive, and find her more resolved than afraid. She had expected, if she was honest, to feel the ground shift beneath her. What she felt instead was a particular clarification, as if the situation had finally named itself, and could therefore be addressed as a thing with edges, rather than a thing that had been spreading in the dark. She thought about Nathaniel, reading to Edmund in the nursery at 3 a.m, and about Mrs. Garland's face at the door, and about the physician's letter in the desk drawer, and she thought that this was the shape of it, that this was what had always been required. At the December assembly, held at the Ashcroft Assembly Rooms on the 18th, Miss Lavinia Forsythe arrived in pale blue muslin with her mother's pearls and said to her companion, within the hearing of enough of the room to accomplish its purpose, "One feels for the poor woman, certainly. The Beast's bride is hardly the figure to rescue anyone from anything, is she?" The county assembly received this with its usual mechanism, which was to turn the words over privately and say nothing publicly, and wait to see how things fell. Cecily had come to the assembly. She had not come wearing the expression of a woman who expected to be rescued. She had arrived knowing the petition's particulars, because Nathaniel had shown her every document. She had arrived knowing that Gerald Forsythe was there with his solicitor and his mother's confidence. She had arrived knowing that the magistrate's review was set for the following week, and that what happened at this assembly would to some extent set the temperature of the room in which that review would be conducted. She stood with Mrs. Garland's testimony, Dr. Harwick's letter, and the knowledge of who had been where on the night in December, and she waited for the right moment. Gerald Forsythe found her near the supper table. He was pleasant in the way of men who believe pleasantness is its own kind of authority, which is to say it was a weapon dressed as a smile. He said in a carrying voice, "Lady Drenmore, it is good to see you venture out. My mother has been concerned for you in all this uncertainty." Cecily looked at him. She said with perfect clarity, "There is no uncertainty, Mr. Forsythe. Mrs. Garland's account of the evening of December the 11th last year is complete, and Dr. Harwick's record confirms it. You may tell your solicitor, if you like, that both will appear before Sir Aldous Crane on the appointed day." The carrying voice had carried. The room turned, not all at once, but sequentially, the way a room does when it senses that the weather has shifted. Gerald Forsythe's pleasantness did not survive this information intact. Something under it adjusted and was not entirely recovered. She said, "Your mother has had the freedom of this house for 14 months. She will not have it any more." He looked at her. He said, "You cannot know what you are defending." "I have lived in Drenmore for 7 weeks," she said steadily. "I know what I have seen. I know who sits with his son at 3 in the morning and who files petitions at magistrates' offices. I know the difference between those two men, and so does everyone who has looked carefully." She stepped back. The room had not returned to its previous business. And then the door of the assembly room opened, and the Marquis of Drenmore came in. He had not attended an assembly since before his first wife's death. The room knew this. The room felt it as rooms feel the entry of the thing they have been discussing in the key of confident certainty just before it arrives in person. He was in his navy tailcoat, the white cravat, the dark breeches, the particular upright carriage of a very tall man who does not apologize for the space he occupies. The scar along his jaw was visible in the candlelight as a quiet and familiar fact. His gray eyes moved across the room and found her. He crossed the room in 3 measured strides, not hurrying, not hesitating, not acknowledging the turning of the assembled company with anything more than the simple action of walking toward what he had come for. He stopped beside her. He looked at Gerald Forsythe for one long moment. Then he looked at the room. "She is the Marchioness of Drenmore," he said, his voice perfectly level and perfectly clear. "And she has been so since November." 11 words, specific and irrevocable. Lady Prudence Vane, at the far end of the room, had raised her fan to the correct angle, and then, in the silence that followed, could not seem to decide what to do with it next. The fan lowered. Her pale blue eyes moved from her nephew to the room and back. And in that movement Cecily saw the woman recalculate something she had been certain of for 14 months and find it would not balance. Miss Forsythe, beside her companion, said nothing. Her pale green eyes had the quality of a person watching a script arrive at a scene they had not been given. The room, after a beat, returned to itself. It returned to a different arrangement of itself. The way furniture returns to its place after a house has been cleaned, and finds itself an inch or two to the left of where it had grown accustomed to standing. Nathaniel looked at Cecily. She looked at him. He offered his arm. She took it, her gloved hand at the sleeve of the navy tailcoat, and she felt through the wool the steadiness of the arm beneath. And she thought that this was what it felt like to be offered a thing that had not been withheld, to be offered it in front of the exact people who had decided she was not worth the offering. The petition before Sir Aldous Crane lasted, in the event, somewhat less time than Gerald Forsyth had anticipated. Mrs. Garland was precise and without sentiment, which was more than adequate. Dr. Harwick's letter was entered as evidence. Nathaniel spoke briefly and without embellishment about the evening of December the 11th, his voice level throughout, giving up the private grief of that night to the plain air of the magistrate's room with the resigned care of a man who has decided that some things must be said aloud in order to protect what remains alive. Sir Aldous Crane dismissed the petition before noon. Lady Prudence Vane left Drenmore 3 days later with her trunks and a formal correspondence from the family solicitor confirming the revised terms of her access to the estate. She left in the manner of a woman who had decided that dignity, under the circumstances, was the only currency still available to her, and she spent it well. Cecily did not gloat. She watched the carriage go and felt only a quiet satisfaction, which was sufficient. Christmas came to Drenmore the way Christmas comes to old stone houses that have been cold for a long time, cautiously at first, and then all at once. Cecily ordered greenery brought in and directed its placement herself, and Mrs. Garland, for the first time since Cecily's arrival, looked as though she approved of something without reservation. There was a fire in every principal room. The pianoforte in the drawing room was opened, the bench lifted, the keys tested. Edmund was brought down each evening for an hour, and he sat in Cecily's lap before the drawing-room fire with the moth painting in his hand, and looked at the candles on the mantel with the wide, uncomplicated attention of a child for whom the world had not yet arranged itself into anything that needed to be defended against. On Christmas Eve, after Edmund had been carried back upstairs by Bethan, Cecily sat at the pianoforte and played. She played quietly, nothing demanding, a simple air that her mother had once taught her. After a moment, Nathaniel came in from the hall and stood near the door, not interrupting, listening. When she finished, she sat with her hands in her lap and the candles behind her. He came and sat in the chair nearest the instrument, which put him close enough that she could see the particular quality of his face in firelight, the scar softened by the warmth of it, the gray eyes open and present in a way that she had come to read as his version of happiness, not its display, but its plain occurrence. He said, "I was not honest with you." She waited. "When I said I did not choose you carelessly." He was looking at his hands. "I chose you because Mrs. Garland had written to me." She had heard that Hartwell was considering 3 possible arrangements for his daughter, and she wrote to tell me she thought you were the one who would be kind to Edmund. He looked up. "I did not tell you this at the time, because I did not know whether it would seem to you like being chosen or like being used." Cecily considered this. The fire shifted. "And now?" she said. He looked at her with the whole of the winter sky gray, unsheltered, the mask entirely absent. "Now I think that I would have chosen you regardless," he said, "and that the letter was fortunate rather than causal." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You are very bad at telling people what you mean." The corner of his mouth shifted, and this time it arrived as a slow, private opening of expression. Not quite a smile, but what precedes a smile in a man who has forgotten how. It transformed the still face with a force that was entirely disproportionate to its small size. It was the most naked thing she had seen on him. She reached forward and placed her hand against his jaw, her fingers resting lightly against the line of the scar. He went very still. His hand came up and covered hers, and they sat like that in the firelit drawing room, her palm against the quieted scar, his hand warm and steady over hers, and neither of them spoke. He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm. Once, soft and deliberate, a kiss that was a question and a promise in the same gesture. She felt it travel from her hand to her chest, where it settled and stayed. He said, against her palm, "Cecily?" She said, "Yes." Outside the drawing room windows, the first snow of the season had begun to fall. On Christmas morning, Bethan brought Edmund downstairs after breakfast, and he came to Cecily with his arms up and his gray eyes bright, and the moth painting clasped in his small, certain hand. She lifted him, and he settled against her with the easy confidence of a creature who has decided it belongs. One small fist curled in the fabric at her shoulder. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. He looked at his son, and then he looked at her, and then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a small object, which he held out to her in his open palm. It was the miniature. Not Edmund's card, but another one, slightly larger that she had not known existed. On it, Helena had painted the moth again, but from a different angle, the wings closed and at rest, and along the lower edge in small, careful letters, "For what endures." Cecily looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Nathaniel. "She painted too," he said. "I found the second in her writing case after the petition was dismissed. I think." He paused. Precisely. In the way he paused when he was choosing the right word rather than an adequate one. She would have been glad of this winter. Cecily closed her fingers around the moth painting. "For what endures." Edmund made a small contented sound and pressed his face into her neck, and the snow outside the window continued its patient work, and the fire behind them held the room in its warm and steady light, and the house that had been cold for so long breathed out at last. Thank you for staying with Cecily and Nathaniel to the very end. If their story moved you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that stayed with you longest.